Star Wars comics at Dark Horse represent an interesting time for the universe, a time where things were played a little more fast and loose, and continuity often contradicted itself, or rather, the word canon didn't have as much iron fisted authority. This isn't to say that no thought was put into continuity and stories had nothing to do with each other, but generally outside of the movies themselves, comics, animation, novels, and video games were treated like a campfire story.
Envision yourself around a campfire. Coruscant's a long ways away, the holonet fails periodically, so you don't get much news out here. And while you're on your second set of s'mores, somebody says, hey, have you ever heard the story of Luke Skywalker and Grand Admiral Thrawn? And he tells you this marvelous tale, and by the time you're in your sleeping bag, you don't know if that was true, based on truth, completely made up, but you enjoyed the story.
If you want Dirge's death to be because Obi-Wan exploded him from the inside out, or because Anakin hurled him into a star, that's really up to you. Now, I don't mean to imply that this was a better or worse time for Star Wars content. I know the Disney era of Star Wars is pretty divisive, but I would argue the comics and novels of the Legends era were pretty much just as hit or miss as current day. However, I do find this time period of comics to be a fascinating look at Star Wars storytelling from a more civilized age.
For a more civilized age.
In 2002, after the release of Attack of the Clones, Dark Horse launched two ongoing comic series. The flagship series was Republic, a continuation of their Star Wars ongoing that followed the events of the Jedi Knights during the Clone Wars. This is a very fascinating comic in its own right and definitely deserves its own video, but today I want to focus on Empire, the other ongoing from the time. This comic served as some respite for fans who were not really feeling the prequel era content and wanted their classic Star Wars fix. If you weren't a big novel reader, this makes a lot of sense because really all other Star Wars content was focused on the Clone Wars multimedia project at the time. I'm sick of hearing about Quinlan Voss. Where are my Darth Vader and Biggs Darklighter stories? Empire spans the time of a few weeks before the events of A New Hope to 8 months after, and switch between one-shot single-issue stories and longer 4 or 5-part stories. In this video, I'd like to go over the series through the lens of its 3 most interesting arcs in my opinion, because this really is a mixed bag. There are plenty of stories in here that are not worth concerning yourself with, but some that are really cool. But without further ado, let's hop into the first story arc. Star Wars Empire starts off with the 4-part story Betrayal, written by Scott Alley with pencils by Ryan Benjamin. These are two guys with expansive careers in comic books and beyond, but unfortunately I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't give at least a little disclaimer about Scott Alley before moving on. I'll put a link to the Hollywood Reporter article in the description, but essentially Dark Horse cut ties with Alley after some sexual abuse allegations came forward about him, specifically from Shauna Gore, a former publicist and editor for Dark Horse. This was after an incident at San Diego Comic-Con in 2015 where Alley assaulted fellow creator Joe Harris at a party. This was only 3 years after Alley had been promoted to editor-in-chief of Dark Horse. He stepped down after apologizing, but continued to work for them as an executive editor. I just wanted to briefly talk about that before we go into the comics because it seems like Alley is a pretty awful dude by all accounts, and I'm sorry that Ryan Benjamin's name is getting lumped in with him here. Anywho, let's get away from that and officially dive into the world of Empire. Okay. One more thing before we get into the story. I just want to shout out these covers for the first arc here done by Brian Horton. I know I've been showing a lot of covers as we've gone through the intro, but these do a great job of pulling me into this seemingly grim, shadowy focus that this story will have. Who's this guy? Why is Darth Vader killing stormtroopers? Well, I'll tell you, my friends. Our story begins with some great Darth Vader action. He's testing out some new troops and asserting his dominance over these wimpy Imperial officers, ordering them to accompany Governor Tarkin to the Death Star, even though this guy Moff Kadir says they're supposed to be part of the Coruscant Guard. This quickly leads into our main plot for these 4 issues, Grand Moff Trachta? Anyway, we'll call him Trachta. Grand Moff Trachta wants to put together a cabal of Imperial officers to enact a plan to overthrow Darth Vader and the Emperor. Palpatine and Trachta meet, and Palpatine tells him to put together a group of troopers that can escort him to the Death Star. Palpatine and Vader meet, and Palpatine tells him to go hunt down this reported lightsaber wielder on the planet Darguli. They think it could be the child of Anakin Skywalker. Okay, great. This first issue does an awesome job of setting up an intriguing, if not pretty predictable story, as well as some solid character work for the relationships that Vader and Palpatine have with the rest of the Empire. I always love the concept of the Imperial officers finding Vader to be gross and annoying, but too scary and powerful for them to do anything about it. Tracta is established to be a pretty intimidating character right off the bat through his character design, as well as this scene where he has stormtroopers shoot their own training officer as a loyalty test. We get a fun, albeit slight in terms of characterization, cast of Imperial officers who join up with Tracta's plan, and predictably, there are immediately plans of backstabbing and power grabbing. I'm always a sucker for scenes between Vader and Palpatine as well, and this one is pretty well written. I'm really loving the pacing of the scenes and the art direction here, so we're off to a solid start. I will say, however, that we know right away that this plan will be unsuccessful, so what will the story do with that? Dramatic irony can be an effective tool, and I don't really need to think like, are they actually going to overthrow the Emperor to enjoy the story? But what will we do beyond this to make me invested and care about these people when they inevitably fail? Finally, before moving on to the second issue, there are a few Anakin flashbacks here. This comic came out after Attack of the Clones and before Revenge of the Sith, so we are limited to moments from the periphery of these movies. But so far, besides just again me being a sucker for Vader having Anakin flashbacks, what will these amount to? I guess at the time there was a lot less content connecting the prequels to the original trilogy, so this could have been novel enough to carry its own weight, but we'll see if they pay off. Issue 2 begins with Vader and his crew taking a detour from their mission to hunt down that lightsaber wielder to hunt down a rebel ship, but it's a trap. Once the ship has been pulled into the Star Destroyer, it explodes. The Cabal smuggles some explosives onto the Emperor's shuttle, knowing that he will never fall for this trap, but planning for it to ensure demand for more troops to guard the palace, an order that Tracta will be happy to fill. He reveals that his other troopers are already in place on Vader's mission. Okay, once again, the art here is absolutely fantastic and goes a long way with keeping me engaged. However, for a 4 issue arc, there already seems to be some filler here. This whole thing with Vader and the Rebel ship seems very disconnected from our main story, and other than providing some badass Vader moments, doesn't do much to advance anything. Issue 3 continues to be carried by the artwork. Things start to kick off, and it turns out the seemingly timid Moff Kadir was planning to assassinate the other high powered Imperials in the Cabal and seize power for himself. So much for Tracta. I would have liked to learn more about that guy or see him do more stuff, but no, he just gets killed. There was an awesome scene where Kadir leads his troop into the Emperor's office and they fight the Imperial guards before Palpatine just unleashes crazy lightning on everyone. Vader also has some great action on the planet of Darguli searching for the lightsaber wielder. I guess the Vader flashbacks are starting to suggest his feelings of wanting to be a father and have an apprentice. It's weird that Obi-Wan says he hopes Anakin is sad when he dies. All right, how do they wrap this up? Well, of course, Boba Fett is here. This kind of falls apart. Vader is fighting off the people on Darguli, and Boba Fett helps him, I guess, to get into the good graces of the Empire. When the lightsaber wielder reveals herself, she is no child of Anakin, but proclaims that she wants to be a Sith. I don't really understand why Boba Fett is so active in this conversation. Maybe I'm missing something. But Vader kills her, and we get to see her naked while she dies. Come on, Ryan Benjamin, what are we doing? I was loving the art so far. Why you gotta do that? But anyway, I guess Vader was pissed that it wasn't actually his kid after he got his hopes up. I thought Vader didn't realize he had kids at this time before A New Hope. So Palpatine doesn't kill Kadir and even admires his ambition, but Kadir is too assured that Darth Vader will fall to his trap. Vader, of course, kills all the stormtroopers and returns to Coruscant, where he's sent to accompany Tarkin to the Death Star after Palpatine realizes it's too dangerous for him to leave. Well, the first arc was pretty solid overall, but again, super carried by the art. The panel by panel action sequencing, as well as the character design and colors, go a long way to making this a very entertaining read. I really like the idea of the Imperial Cabal and Grand Moff Tracta, but I feel like none of these characters got fleshed out enough for me to care about them. Maybe just cut the whole Vader subplot and focus more on these dudes to make it more of a satisfying ending when their plan fails. Even though this is to be expected from a story like this, I quite like the idea that maybe if these guys all truly work together without their own hidden agendas, they might be able to succeed. But Palpatine knows to put ambitious, power hungry individuals in positions of power, so they will never truly work together. It kind of parallels the rule of two for the Sith in a way. This is definitely enough to make me want to keep reading, but when I first started this series and didn't know anything about it, I thought it might be like 40 ongoing issues about this Imperial Cabal and their desperate attempts to stay alive or grasp for power under the thumb of Palpatine and Vader, but that was not meant to be. I just have to shift my expectations a little. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. One of my other favorite arcs that lasts more than 2 issues is To the Last Man, spanning from issues 16 to 18, written by Wells Hartley and David Fabry. Wells Hartley is a pseudonym for Randy Stradley, who was the editor for all the Star Wars Dark Horse comics at the time. From my perspective, the story seems to want to highlight the difference between presented power and real power. The first page shows us the Imperial facility on Karita shortly after the Battle of Yavin, showing a display of power with the goose stepping in the tanks. However, we are told that no word of the destruction of the Death Star has trickled down to the expansive facets of the Empire. Then we hard cut to the reality of war and service to the Empire on the jungles of Maradoon. I love the transition from the clean, orderly boots marching in a parade context to the dirty, uneven steps of the soldiers out in the wild. This is reinforced by the text box telling us things in practice are rarely as elegant as they are in theory. Next, the main character of this arc, Lieutenant Janik Sunber, is introduced. He's established as a hardworking, self respecting individual who doesn't make excuses or expect life to give him handouts. He's pictured on the ground with infantry stormtroopers while his senior officers lord over him from the relative comfort and safety of their transport. Captain Gage has been a specifically annoying aspect of life in the Empire for Sunber, as Gage's family and connections have put him on the fast track to success rather than hard work. Damn, they really got me sympathizing with an Imperial officer. I don't mean, oh, my life has been so hard and I resent people with success. I just think the comic does a great job of instantly humanizing Sunber for us. I'm sure most of us would disagree with his politics, but he is much more down to earth, literally, than most of the officers we've been presented with in Star Wars media. His life path led him here. He's just a guy. This is solidified by Sunber helping his troops pull their turbo tank out of the mud, earning their respect and the judgment of his superiors. The troops are then ambushed by the native Aminin, but thanks to quick thinking from Sunber, damages are minimal. However, the unit is left confused because the Animen aren't supposed to be hostile and apparently only engage in ritualistic combat amongst themselves. Ooh, the troops cross a spooky threshold into a world they don't understand. I wonder if there will be consequences for arrogance. Let's take a moment to highlight the artwork and pacing of this issue combined with the text boxes here. The sun is a torch. The waves of humidity rising up from the grassy plain are almost a physical obstruction. His stormtroopers' cooling systems whine and protest, and for the first time in his short career, Sunbert envies them their cumbersome armor. Turns out the group's destination was a mining facility they were supposed to oversee. They find the workers all killed and the drill shot full of blaster holes. It seems the Aminin have armed themselves with Imperial weaponry. Pretty much the rest of this whole issue is Sunber being smart and the commanding officers being stupid. The general respects Sunber and his ideas do save some lives, but the Aminin are crafty. They set up defenses, but the Aminin ambush, and in the morning they set up a full display of power which the Imperials are ill-equipped to deal with now that their tanks have been sabotaged. Now the next 2 issues are pretty predictable. It's more of Gage making bad choices and Sunber making smart ones, stormtroopers dying, and so forth. While this does make it so there isn't too much for me to talk about, I still really like these issues. I'm always a fan of a central location being a defense holdout and lots of well-drawn action. Sunburst promoted to captain during this, and then after the battle has this revoked by official tribunal, highlighting the Imperial priorities of rules and order over merit, something we'll see a counterexample of in the issues I'll talk about next. Turns out this was all a ritualistic battle after all, and all the Aminin find them worthy or whatever. I will say the main strength of these issues beyond just strong art and writing is the way it plays with perspective. I touched on it earlier, but we are kind of forced to care about these Imperial soldiers by virtue of focus. They are the protagonists of this story, and you can almost start to cheer for them. But then they'll absolutely massacre a group of native Aminin, and it's a fast reminder of the larger scope of things. Pretty cool stuff. The last big arc, no pun intended, that I want to talk about is Darklighter, which takes place over issues 8, 9, 12, and 15, spaced out because of artwork taking a long time. These are written by Paul Chadwick with art by Doug Wheatley, and is maybe the strongest story Empire has to offer. As you may have guessed, this tells the story of Biggs Darklighter, Luke's buddy from Tatooine, and again deals with some dramatic irony. Any Star Wars fan worth their weight in salt, is that the phrase, knows that Biggs dies saving Luke's life during the trench run on the Death Star. But what was his deal? Biggs was a character I always liked for some reason, even though he's almost completely cut from the original theatrical release of the movie and gets one scene in the special edition. The idea of Luke having a personal connection to people in the rebellion that are friends from back home is a compelling idea to me. So the story starts off with Biggs and Luke working on the Skyhopper on Tatooine. I like this characterization where Biggs sort of acts as an older brother to Luke and sticks up for this whiny little dude, and people don't know how Luke's going to handle himself once Biggs has gone to the Imperial Academy. Biggs has dinner at the Lars household, and Owen freaks the F out as soon as there's any mention of Luke leaving the farm. Also, quick shout out to Star Wars food being disgusting as always. There's a great montage paralleling Biggs' training at the Imperial Academy and Luke's life on Tatooine, and we get a pretty interesting take on Tarkin's philosophy on the Empire.
Only through the protection of power do we bring order. The inefficiencies of non-standard practices, of trade barriers, of restrictions due to cultures and provincial interest, all will be swept away. There will be order through power.
Biggs does some nice plot convenient detective work on discovering what the Death Star is and then meets Hobby. This is Derek Clivian, who in canon timeline now died during the Battle of Hoth, but had much more of an ongoing legacy in Legends, appearing as a recurring character in Stackpole's Rogue Squadron series, among other things. They really hate each other. I wonder if that'll change by the end of this here story. Biggs and Hobby are assigned to the Rand Ecliptic, and Biggs returns to Tatooine for a little break before going off. This is where we get the deleted scene from A New Hope with a bit of a wrinkle to it. Biggs tells Luke he's planning on jumping ship with his buddies to join a rebel contact, but this actually isn't true. He's just made it up because he's got the idea in his head, but it's what he plans to do, what he wants to do, I guess. I really like this first issue. It characterizes Biggs as a leader and serves as a great example of a story I'm sure many rebels share. You can fully understand people joining up with the Empire feeling as though it could be their only chance to break out of a monotonous, meaningless life. Then, once they're immersed in it, either letting it consume them or realizing they can't be a part of it. The art from Doug Wheatley is also absolutely fantastic here. It really makes me want to read more stuff he's drawn because, my goodness, to be so good at naturalistic human faces as well as technology is one thing, but the real success in comic art, I believe, is having great individual designs in the panels, but also having a grasp on sequential storytelling panel to panel. This guy Wheatley seems to be great at pacing out scenes, whether they're moment-to-moment conversations in a room or more montagey showing important moments of a longer period of time. Bravo. Alright, time for Mutiny on the Rand Ecliptic. This next issue really effectively communicates how a realistic defection from the Empire would happen. We get a solid look at life on a Star Destroyer. We're introduced to Captain Hellisk, a no-nonsense boss for Hobby and Biggs to suck up to. Well, seemingly Hobby is the suck-up and Biggs just gets by on competency and looking awesome in a cape. These guys do not get along. We get some backstory for Biggs and how he used to have a little girlfriend, and then the real meat of the issue comes. The Rand Ecliptic comes into contact with a vessel that is unable to supply correct Imperial codes, and Hellisk determines they must be rebels. Biggs gets out there with his squad and orders some skilled shots to disable the ship without destroying it, but someone hits the reactor and the whole thing full of civilians and children blows up. Damn, I mean, this is some emotionally effective artwork right here. The text boxes do a great job of selling the impact on Biggs as well. This is probably the most brutal moment we get in the entire series of Empire, but I think it's totally justified and not just used for shock value. This is the kind of thing that would happen in service to the Empire, and making the reader sit with it really puts us in the shoes of Biggs. Also, I know I was talking about how lore and continuity wasn't as strict back in this era, but I do find it funny the comic felt obligated to put a note about why you can see the pilots' faces. Hellisk isn't concerned that they destroyed the ship, and Biggs knows he can't be a part of this ish any longer, so they plan to defect. They escape in some TIE fighters and hope that they can rendezvous with some other kind of ship before their systems run out. Look at this cute little TIE fighter meeting. The Darklighter story finishes up in issues 12 and 15. Biggs and his fellows go back to the Rand Ecliptic because they need fuel and find that Hobby is taking control of the ship. If they had just talked, they could have worked together. Now, in an effort not to just plot summarize, I like the theme of rebel leadership being based on earned merit rather than arbitrary rank. Biggs recognizes this and leaves command with Hobby. They get to the Yavin base and Dodonna briefs them on a mission to get some X-Wings for the rebellion. This issue is a little more going through the motions of a plot, but it's still a really fun one with exciting visuals. Star Wars food is disgusting again. They have a plan that involves ejecting from their TIE fighters and waiting for pickup. Not sure this makes the most logical sense, but it's a super dynamic visual sequence with effective text boxes.
The fighter's passage takes no more than the inhalation of a breath. In other words, an eternity.
I really like that there are actual consequences to this risky plan. The art and text really communicates how chaotic this whole thing is and how it happens so fast you have to just do your thing and then worry about everyone else once it's over. Hobby loses his leg and Curran didn't make it at all. Who's Curran? I don't know. But the art is cool and it has a believable effect on Biggs and the rest of the crew. Biggs shoots a damn TIE fighter out of the sky. Pretty awesome. This next bit feels a little rushed, but they run some more missions, get more X-Wings and R2 units, more pilots die, more bonds are made, and Porkins is here. By the end of this, Hobby's wound has badly infected him and Biggs is upset. This is the core of the issues right here, I think, Biggs and Hobby's relationship. It's something we've probably all seen before, but it's executed rather effectively. They hate each other and don't trust each other at first, and through experiences, they bond and form respect, and now they care about each other deeply. The final issue of Darklighter carries some somber dramatic irony if you've seen Star Wars. Imagine reading this and not having seen Star Wars, but anyway, I think this is potentially the strongest issue of the arc and maybe the Empire series altogether. It's split up into two halves that fuse thematically really effectively. The first half is lush with color and nature as Biggs and some friends try to find a cure for Hobby's infection out in the wilderness. One of Biggs' companions, Dr. Shay Polikex, has a monologue that is essentially an explanation of the Force from a biological standpoint without ever actually mentioning the Force explicitly.
It's the wonder of co-evolution. Generations of organisms evolving in proximity over millennia. They endlessly interact, stress each other with each new mutation. Inevitably, they develop defenses against each other as surely as your toes develop calluses exactly where your boots rub them.
Then Biggs goes on to feel the Force in nature and his connection to living creatures when he's forced to kill a carnivore attacking his party.
Biggs experiences a weird intimacy with this dying, semi-intelligent being. He feels the death himself. Deeply shaken, Biggs is awash in thoughts of life and death and feelings he could never put into words.
Look at how the artwork just silently reinforces these themes of cosmic connection through biology and the connected nature of all life. The second half of the issue is the Death Star attack from Biggs' perspective. In contrast to the vibrancy of the first half of the issue, this is understandably cold, technological, and barren. Now, maybe because of his experiences in nature, Biggs is feeling the Force hardcore right here without realizing it. He feels alive in the moment of adrenaline as a pilot, knowing that he is living in pure accordance with his values to stand up for what he believes. He intuits something special about Luke and seems to know that the mission relies on the safety of his childhood friend. This eventually leads to a sacrifice, saving Luke and allowing him to blow up the Death Star, as we all know. Hobby looks on the hologram of Biggs and thanks him. What's really beautiful about this to me is the theme of balancing the living force and the cosmic force. In this issue, the survival of Hobby and the destruction of the Death Star are treated as equal matters of importance. Helping one individual can feel less important than a large-scale galactic assault, but if we compromise helping people who immediately need help for the greater good, then we might fall down a path of blind pragmatism. The Empire is treated like the galactic carnivore or a predator on a much larger scale, and Biggs' life through service to the Empire and subsequent defection connects him to the cosmic food chain, not only between individuals, but large political structures. Without sounding too dramatic, I think Biggs reaches an enlightened state by the time of his death. This issue really rocks, and I hope I've done a good enough job of explaining how great the two halves synthesized to create an emotionally resonant story that hits on some of the best themes Star Wars has to offer. Well done, Chadwick and Wheatley, and rest well, Mr. Darklighter.